Hello, everybody, and welcome to Starting Small Music. I'm Justin McCormick, and you're about to hear a conversation with an artist, musician, and music industry professional on their journey and how they got to where they are today. At Starting Small, we like to take you on a journey uncovering the untold stories of your favorite songs and artists. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. How you doing today, Danny?
Good. Fantastic.
Awesome,
How about
man. I'm doing great. So getting right in your story, you grew up in Panama City, Florida, and what was your childhood like?
it was interesting. We did about 200 shows a year with my family band. We had an Opry show down there, and so I didn't really know a whole lot outside of that. I went to public school and did that, but we did a lot of traveling with the family on occasion. But mostly we did like shows in our family's theater down there. We had about 1,000-seat theater, and did 200 shows a year. And in addition to our family shows, which had aunts, uncles, grandma and grandpa, cousins, all singing and playing stuff. My granddad would promote Grand Ole Opry type artists.
Oh,
So
sick.
we would have 10 or 12 of those shows throughout the years, mostly in the wintertime when the snowbirds were down. He would promote those shows. And so throughout the years, we had everybody from, Glen Campbell to Tammy Wynette, Oak Ridge Boys, Randy Travis, you name it. It was just a much shorter list of artists that didn't come through than those that did. But
Now,
it was
I'm
a
sure.
cool opportunity to get to watch that firsthand, as a kiddo growing up.
For sure, and I'm assuming that growing up in a musical family like that, you probably were you able to pick any of these big musicians' brains as they came into town. I'm sure, like you already loving music yourself. Did you get any advice from these people when they're coming into town?
Certainly, once I got old enough to really be kind of like hip to the thing and realize that this is kind of what I wanted to do with my life. Once I got into my teenage years, I would always kind of sign up and be the first to go up and want to help get them set up and get their monitors set up and plugged in, and just anything I could do to be around it. Get to kind of see how they interacted with each other and how they ran a sound check and all those little things that I was just kind of curious about, like what's it like, at that level.
Yeah,
And so it's pretty cool to get a front row seat. So and there's a handful of musicians that came through that played with artists like Porter Wagner. The first guy that comes to mind is a piano player named Gordon Mote. He came through and he was playing with Porter, and this is before I had moved to town. And I met him very briefly and said, I'm going to move up to Nashville soon. And he was super encouraging and super kind. I said, well, yeah, hit me up when you do. And I don't know if you are familiar with Gordon or not. He's blind. He's been blind his entire life.
oh wow.
And so he's just a brilliant piano player that is, all of his other senses are just so heightened. And he's just a next level genius kind of guy. But I hadn't seen him in months. And then I was doing some engineering work on a project in town. Once I got to Nashville, just kind of engineering some overdubs for a producer. And he had Gordon coming in to do some keyboard overdubs. And the second Gordon walked in the door, I all I said was, "Hi, Gordon," and he recognized my voice immediately. He goes, "Oh, Danny Rader from Panama City, Florida. How you doing? Oh, boy, how's your family?" And I was just like blown away at that, But there was
That's
a few
crazy.
of those situations where I would meet somebody down there and then run into him once I got back up to town, and it was just always really cool to make that connection and have a pretty good little jumping off point.
For sure. Now, you actually picked up drums at age of 2, which you probably don't even remember the first time you sat down at the drum set. Did your parents tell you like what made them get you a drum set first?
Well, our whole family played and sang it, so it was all around. It wasn't even like they went out and got me a drum set at 2. I just sat down at the drum set that was on the stage, or
Gotcha.
in the studio. My dad ran a studio too, so I'm sure there were times at that point where he would, there's videos of it. I don't have as vivid memories of it, but there were definitely times when he would just sit me on his lap and like take my hands and help me kind of play it, boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, the kind of a groove. And so I think from such a young age, there was just some muscle memory that was starting to develop there, and just kind of getting the arms and the muscles used to those motions. And then I kind of just took it and ran with it eventually down the road.
Now, not only playing a lot of music from a young age, who are some of the first artists or albums that kind of stick out in memory to you from your childhood that kind of really got you interested in music?
Oh man, certainly. Like much of my early childhood was very old school country stuff. It was George Strait, Merle Haggard, Conway Twitty, Tammy Wynette, Oak Ridge Boys, a lot of that kind of stuff. And then I remember once I got to like teenage years and I really started learning guitar and diving into guitar voicings and how to play that. I remember being really impressed and influenced by like the Eagles records, Bread, Jim Croce, James Taylor, some of those really intricate kind of chords where you could really hear the voicings that they were playing and some of that stuff. And I really was moved by that. And then eventually down the road, of course, Tom Petty and the Beatles, and kind of can't avoid that stuff, and can't deny what great records those were.
And I mean, you mentioned Glen Campbell too. I mean, I think that he doesn't get the credit for that he deserves. I think he's one of the greatest guitar players of all time, and especially like the people that like the harder rock stuff. If you would have just turned up the drive on his amp, he would have been able to play with any of those guys, you know?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and most people don't realize how many records he played on before he even became a solo artist of his own accord. You know, all those
Right.
Wrecking Crew stuff, movie soundtracks, surf records, Beach Boys records. He played on so many of those things and sang so many background parts before he even became Glen Campbell, the artist.
Right.
You know, like the two careers, either one by themselves would have been phenomenal, but to have had both of those careers, it was like, get out of here.
Unheard of for sure. Now, in 2004, you made the decision to move to Nashville. What was that decision like? Was it kind of a big deal to leave the family band, or were they encouraging you to go to Nashville?
You know, they were actually really encouraging. I never had any pushback from anybody. I think they all knew and could see that that was where I wanted to go. And I always wanted to come to Nashville. I had no desire to really go to LA or New York or any of the other kind of music industry cities, just because I had such a deep love for country music, especially,
Yeah.
that it was always going to be Nashville for me. And so no, they were super supportive. I had kind of gotten to a point where I was doing a lot of local session work back home at that point. I'd work in a studio. There were 3 or 4 project studios around within like an hour and a half radius of where I lived in Panama City that I could go track. And a lot of those would do like one record a week or so. They kind of track on one day, cut vocals in a day, and then spend a couple days mixing, and then kind of do that same thing each week, you know, and a different artist would be coming through. So I had done a lot of work down there on that stuff, but had just kind of gotten to a point where I really wanted to kind of explore the space a little bit and get outside and just see if I could make it in Nashville, you know. And so my wife and I, we had gotten married back home, and we got to a point where I had finished. We had actually both finished our 2-year degrees at community college back home. So we moved to Nashville, and she finished her schooling at Belmont. And I just hit the pavement when we got to town and started trying to find work as a guitar player.
Now, did you have a preference at that time when you first moved, if you wanted to do session work opposed to going on the road, or will you just say anything that comes my way, I'm going to take it?
You know, my first love was session work. If I would have had a full plate of session work, I would have never taken a road gig, because that was definitely what I moved to town wanting to do and my first love. But I did not realize before I moved to town what a long list of people it was trying to get that work. And so I kind of took a road gig or two out of necessity, just to keep the lights on until I could really get the session thing happening. And what I found was that I kind of had moved to town at an interesting time, in that before I had moved to town back in like the 90s up to about 2000, 2005, there was a very distinct line between road players and session players. And you either did one or the other, but guys really didn't do much of both.
Yeah.
Right about the time that I moved to town, I think part of it had to do with the amount of session work kind of coming down a little bit. There weren't quite as many artists signed, and so there wasn't quite as much session work. So it was kind of a time when a lot of the session players would take one road gig, and so they would do their sessions, but they might also go out and tour with Vince Gill and do 50 shows a year with him, or they'd go out and do, 50 shows a year with Tim McGraw or whatever he had, and so there was kind of like the blurring of the lines between session and road work. And so I think I kind of benefited from that, being able to kind of not brand myself, but really just get people used to the fact that, hey, I can entertain and play really well on stage and do this thing, but I also spend a lot of time with headphones on it, and I can do records too.
Yeah.
So I, like I said, I took the first gig or two just to keep the lights on, and I toured with Jason Aldean for about a year and a half early on in his career. But what I found is that, like, as I, went from that gig to, I played with Leanne Rimes for about a year. Then I spent a few years with Gretchen Wilson. And then I eventually ended up out with Keith Urban,
Yeah.
or landing here with Kenny Chesney. But each time I felt like as my road gigs were kind of increasing in status and whatever, my session work was also kind of growing right alongside it. So I had these kind of these two facets of my career that were kind of climbing at the same time and adjusting on the fly. And it was kind of really, really worked out to be able to have time at home still. The gigs that I ended up on weren't too busy, so that I still had plenty of time to do the session thing and get that off the ground.
And I think that you moved to town at a really cool period too, because just around that time is when Big and Rich just released Save a Horse Riding Cowboy. Jason Aldean was starting to do the rock stuff, and you kind of were coming into town when the lines were starting to blur between rock and country too. How was that for you as a guitarist?
It was an interesting thing to kind of watch and also be somewhat of a participant in. It's funny because most of my session work has been in the acoustic chair. So I do acoustic guitar, banjo, mandolin, bouzouki, all kinds of random string things like that.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the records, probably, I don't know, 60-70% of the records that I have played on were in that chair. But a lot of times when I'd go out to play on the road, I was playing mostly electric because you end up needing the two electrics, the power, and that kind of thing. If people want to kind of rock out the live show a little more. And so I was kind of seeing it from both sides, but it also gave me a unique perspective on, trying to take off the session guy hat and put on the road guy hat, and realize that what we're doing for the record may not be the thing that needs to be represented live.
Yeah.
Same time, it's right for the record. If you just did what we do live on the recording, it wouldn't necessarily be the best way to go about for country radio and making things sound like they need to sound for the sake of a record. And so you really kind of learn how to approach them both completely as different beasts and different animals.
For sure. Now in 2010, like you said, you joined Keith Urban's band. How did you and Keith first meet?
I actually knew all of the band guys over there before I had met Keith. I knew all of them, and they kind of had a need for a guy that did what I do. And to Keith's credit, he actually trusted the band guys, and so I was actually already hired before I even played a note of music with him.
Really?
Yeah. There's no audition or anything with that one. It was just I had done enough work with the other band guys, and they all just basically said to Keith, when they were talking it up, and said, "Oh no, Rader's the guy. He'll kill it." And so he was like, "All right, great, let's bring him in." And so I went by the studio when he was cutting one day just to meet him and kind of put a face with the name and the reputation and whatnot. And it was super cool. And it was like, all right, well, you got the gig, so don't worry about that, And then it was like everything just kind of like settled down. It was great. Yeah.
We had Nathan Barlow on the show a few weeks ago, and he said when he joined Keith's band that yeah, for sure, crazy musician. But the first thing he said when he got introduced to the band was that he was just joining a rock and roll band. Did you have that same feeling?
Yeah, it was interesting how really interesting to see how Keith's thing has evolved over the years, for sure. Because when I started in that band, for example, I was doing keys and B3 type stuff. I actually had a full keyboard rig with 2 keyboards and a B3, and I did that on like half the night when I first started out there. And then a good chunk of the rest of the stuff I was doing acoustic-y, banjo, mandolin type stuff, and electric on 4 or 5 songs maybe. But over time, as the personnel evolved and as Keith evolved musically, it had evolved away from that till the point that it was basically Keith and I on guitars and drums and bass until we added Nathan, and then Nathan kind of brought the whole Phantom craziness in.
Now, when you were on the road with Keith, there was like 7 different versions of Somewhere in My Car that were released. Did you guys do the same version every night, or was it like, okay, tonight you're starting this off on the piano or stuff like that?
We pretty much had an arrangement down, but once we did it on the road, although from year to year it would evolve a little bit, but based on what they had released to pop radio or to country radio, we didn't really necessarily change our arrangement based on that. But when personnel changes, like when Nate came in, we did kind of reapproach the parts or whatever. Like a good example of that song, when I started, I was just playing banjo on that song.
Mhm.
And after a couple of years of being there, Brian Nutter, who used to be there and play electric on that song, he left. And so then it was just me and Keith on guitars. And we had that guitar, it's called the Monster, built, which Brian actually built about a year after he had been off the gig. But it's got it's got a telly on the top and a Ganjo on the bottom. It's a double neck.
Oh, wow.
It allowed me on songs like that, or Somebody Like You, a few of those songs that have pretty signature Ganjo parts that I needed to play, but also I didn't want to be stuck on a Ganjo the whole song. It
Right.
allowed me to flick a switch and go down to electric, or come up to electric and be able to play rhythm electric when Keith went up to solo. That way I could still hold down the fort and play plenty of power and rhythm stuff, or twin hymn or whatever. And that kept us from having to be so dependent on track usage in those early days before, everybody started kind of using a bunch of support tracks,
Right.
which is kind of fun. And I love the idea and the art of crafting a part and taking 4 or 5 parts from the record and coming up with a thing that you can do on the fly, and just a little more old school rock and roll. Just let's play it, instead of having a bunch of tracks and stuff.
For sure. Now, we talked a little bit about your session work, 62 number ones and counting. Do you have any songs that stick out to you? I mean, there's so many now, or like any ones that you were playing on that, like, while you were playing it, you're like, oh, this is going to be a smash.
Yeah. It's a good question. I still remember some of the first Aldine stuff that I played on, that because those were some of the first number ones that I played on. I think Relentless was one of those. My Kind of Party was a big one. Dirt Road Anthem was a big one. Somewhere on a Beach was that one is pretty memorable to me, particularly because that was one of the first that ended up going number one that I had done a lot of stuff on just at my place. The producer Ross Copperman, who worked on that record, he and I have a great relationship and do a lot of work where he'll just send me a song that's been tracked with drums, bass, and a few guitars, and he'll just send it over to me and say, man, help me, let's finish this thing out. Just do your thing and put your magic on it. And so I'll add a few electrics, maybe some programming, some synths, and just kind of finish it out and send it back to him and see what he thinks. And usually he's like, yeah, that's great. So that one, it was pretty memorable too, because that was one of the first ones that went number one that I had been able to have a really, really kind of big, heavy hand in the final stages of it, which was pretty fun.
Was there any songs that Ross or anyone else sent to you that you thought you were just playing on the demo and then your part ended up making the final track?
Oh, for sure. That's happened a time or two. Yeah. That's happened a time or two. I'm trying to remember one of the examples in particular. I feel like there was a Luke Bryan thing a few records back that yeah, I had played on one version of it, and then it ended up kind of being on the record as well. Yeah.
That's dope. Now, 3-time ACM nominee for Specialty Musician of the Year. I know everyone says they don't do it for the awards, but that's still super cool, especially to be honored by all your peers. How do you feel about winning that so many times?
Well, it's pretty cool. Yeah. So I won the specialty category twice, and I actually won in the guitar category once. And honestly, the guitar one was one that like really kind of I was taken aback by, just because there's so many. There's not as many guys that do like the acoustic kind of utility type thing. But when you're in a category with all the other guitar players that are so brilliant here in town, guys like Derek Wells or Adam Schoenfeld and Rob McNally, and I'm just gonna forget guys, but like it's such a great, crazy list of talent. To have been able to win that one is just like, no, I don't believe you. Something's wrong.
Now, coming out of Keith's band, obviously you're on the road with Kenny now. How did you and Kenny meet up?
So I actually started working with Kenny in the studio back in 2014-ish, I believe. The American Kids record, whatever record that was on.
Yeah.
I started working with him on his records at that point, and it played on everything since then. And so we had a really great working relationship. And once things kind of ended with Keith, COVID happened, and nobody was touring or doing anything. And so once Keith went back out on the road, he had decided, that he wanted to kind of lean more into the pop thing. And so added a track guy and some of that kind of stuff. And so that was kind of like, he didn't want to have other guitar players on stage kind of thing is how I understand it. But so I was just in town doing session stuff at that point, and I signed a pub deal. So I'm, writing and getting into production work in a more tangible way than I have in the past. And so I was not really looking for any kind of road gig at this point. And they had to make a few personnel changes in Kenny's camp. And one of them was a guitar player situation. Mm-hmm. And I'd known Wyatt, his band leader, forever. And he calls me about the first of this year in 22. And he's like, hey, man, I don't know if you even want to leave town or not, or if this would be on your radar, but, we're going to need somebody out with Kenny. And if you want it, the gig's yours. Kenny knows you. We know it'll be a good fit. So let me know. If you want to do it, let's do it. And it was kind of like, well, yeah, why wouldn't I do that?
When Kenny calls, you can't say no.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So it's like, why wouldn't I want to go out and play 25 stadiums this year, football stadiums? It's like, of course.
Right. Do you have a favorite song in the set that comes up every night that you're kind of looking at your set list and you're like, this one's coming up, I'm getting pumped?
That's a great question. Honestly, American Kids is one of my favorites. That and Setting the World on Fire both are really fun. Because one thing that's really, obviously the crowd's awesome. The songs are great. But those for me are really the first time that I've ever, and a lot of the set here, it's the first time I've ever really been able to tour songs that I played on the recordings.
Yeah.
I really didn't play on that many recordings with Keith along the way because he played so many of the guitar parts. And with Aldine, when I toured with him, although I've played on all the recordings since then, I wasn't when I toured with him. And so it's been kind of an interesting thing that this is the first time that I've been able to tour songs that I played on and had a hand in creating, which is a really cool, special thing, and doesn't happen that much when you're just a side guy, if you're not like in a band project, so it's a pretty big blessing. I'm thankful for that. It's a lot of fun.
Now, did you do the acoustic work on the American Kids record?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
man, because ever since you mentioned that, I'm kind of geeked out because man, everyone knows that like the intro to American Kids. That's just amazing. It's just chords, but everyone knows that when it comes on.
Yeah, on that one in particular, Kenny Greenberg and I were both doubling acoustics on the go down. And so I was playing acoustic and he was playing acoustic. And then I stacked I think I stacked a bouzouki in the choruses for a strum. And then, of course, the banjo hook, which is pretty signature kind of thing.
That's so sick. Now,
and one interesting thing about that one, too, when we got to the solo section that has the we hadn't even talked about me playing a banjo solo. I just kind of went for it on the tape when I was playing it. And I was like, I might be asked to simplify this at some point. but I did it and they were like, they loved it. So, all right, we'll keep it.
That's sick. Now, I like to close all my interviews by asking my guests a piece of advice that you've learned kind of on your journey in music and something you would kind of tell a younger musician.
Oh, that's a great one. If I could give myself one piece of advice, looking back, it would probably be to stop worrying so much about where I'm going or where I want to be or how I can get where I want to be, and to focus more on how I can contribute and be a blessing where I am, and then if you do that effectively, then that will lead to other stuff, and just trust that the road in front of you will be pleasing, but just try to be present and contribute where you are,
Hey guys, thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment, and check out my music on all streaming platforms at Justin McCormick. See you guys next time.